With this second PowerPoint on the topic of race and racism, I will briefly explain how the very concept of race has changed throughout history. As you know, human beings always tried to explain why human variation exists, why we don't all look the same, why do what we call races exist. And in the Western world, of course, the Bible and religion were first used to look for an explanation. But the problem is, there is no clear explanation in the Bible about why human beings don't all look the same. There is no mention of the concept of race in the Bible. But still, religious people, try to find an explanation there, so they really had to read between the lines. And the curse of Ham in the Genesis, in the first book of the Bible, has been used in some interpretation of racial diversity in the world. And of course, interpretation as to why some races should be inferior and some others should be superior. The curse of Ham goes like this. It's about Noah, who liked to drink wine once in a while, a lot of wine. And one night, he fell asleep drunk in his tent. And his 3 sons, when they came back home, found him like that, passed out. And 2 of his sons respectfully covered him, but Ham, the 3rd son, laughed at him sleeping there naked. And when he woke up, Noah found out what happened and was very angry at his 3rd son, and he cursed Ham and all his descendants to eternal servitude and enslavement. In early Semitic language, Ham means dark. This is why the link was made with being enslaved or being a servant and having dark skin. There is nothing clearly written in the Bible that says that. It's a later interpretation of the writings. But until the 16th century in Europe, people were not so concerned about racial diversity, about a hierarchy between different variations of the human species. Because there were not so many contacts as well between different populations on Earth. But in the 16th century, things have changed because Europeans started to explore the world. Navigation developed. And Europeans established direct links with populations of Asia, Africa, Oceania, and the Americas even. And the 16th century saw the rise of colonial empires. Europeans started conquering the world, establishing colonies abroad where they were totally dominant, and they started the systematic enslavement and subordination of local populations. I have explained last year in anthropology why this happened with Europeans and not the other way around, so I will not repeat it here. But this is a fact that Europeans expanded their power all over the world during the 16th century. And a kind of racial ideology developed at the same time because it was really convenient for Europeans. Racism really developed together with the establishment of European colonies in other continents. For white Europeans, First Nations in any other continent, in the Americas, in Africa, in Oceania, were considered suitable for slavery. They were not considered totally human. In the drawing here, you see a picture by Guaman Poma. He was a Spanish chronicler, a Spanish religious man who lived in the Americas during the 16th century. And you clearly see here in the image how Spanish colonizers were treating indigenous populations. It was convenient to have these supposedly inferior people to have cheap labor, to have people to exploit for labor, for any kind of tasks that could not be done by Europeans. So the fact that they were considered inferior or not quite human was really convenient at the time. So this culturally made ideology of a classification of races and the fact that some of them are inferior and that the white race is on top of the hierarchy, it lasted during a long time. And it was convenient for the Europeans in their thirst to dominate the world. It's totally cultural, this classification, this ideology, and it was instrumental in the rise of colonial empires. And it's lasting until today, unfortunately. But during the 18th century, some scholars were trying for the first time to put some science on it and to try to scientifically classify human races. But it's not an easy task because, as you know, human variation is continuous. And what we call races, they fade into each other. They're not totally monolithic. And from last week, you probably remember, I hope you remember, Carl von Linné, with his binomial classification of species. This binomial classification we still use today. We use the binomial classification of Linné to give names to animal species, and we used it to give a name to the human being, Homo sapiens. The classification of Homo sapiens is using the binomial classification of Linné, but was not done. This term, Homo sapiens, was not brought by Linné. It was brought by later scientists who used his classification. For Linné, in fact, there were 4 human species, not races, species. And these human species mixed physical traits, he gave colors to each, and behavioral traits. So both for Linné were linked. These 4 species were Homo americanus for First Nations of the Americas, Homo asiaticus, Homo africanus, and Homo europeanus. The 4th one, of course, being on top of the hierarchy, because Linné saw these 4 different human species as a hierarchy, one on top and the other ones below. Each one of the 4 species would be characterized by some different qualities. For example, Homo asiaticus was ruled by opinions. And of course, Homo europeanus was the only civilized species governed by laws. Approximately at the same time as Linné, another scholar brought another classification of human races, the one we still use today in some cases. And this scholar was Blumenbach. I did not talk about Blumenbach last week when I was talking about evolution, because Blumenbach did not write anything about evolution. He wrote only about the classification of human races. So when Linné said that there were 4 races, Blumenbach says there are 5. And these 5 races would be Africans, American First Peoples, he called them Indians at the time, Mongolians, this is what we call today Asians. It comes from the word Mongolia, which is a country of Central Asia. You see it on the map on the right. The 4th one is Caucasians. We still use this word today to describe white people and Caucasians. It comes from the 18th century. It comes from Blumenbach. The arrow on the map shows the Caucasus Mountains. And for Blumenbach, the ideal women, the most attractive women in the world, were living in the Caucasus Mountains, and this is why he chose this name for the white race. So we still use it in the 21st century because of the personal taste of Mr. Blumenbach. And the fifth race would be Malay, to describe people from South Pacific Islands. Linné, Blumenbach, and all their colleagues during the 18th century who tried to put some order or to classify human variation into discrete races were still totally racist. They were still believing in a hierarchy of races, putting European white men on top of it. They were not mentioning evolution. They, as you saw last week, Lide was creationist, he was fixist. He did not bring the idea of evolution. They were fixists. And for them, as for everyone during the same century, God created man white, and other variants of the human species just degenerated from the original white man created by God because of climatic influence, because of a lot of factors. So this was the general way of thinking among scholars in the 18th century. And this is in this kind of intellectual context about human variation that Darwin came into the picture in the 1800s. So Darwin, as you know, brought the first right explanation about the mechanisms of evolution. So for that precise idea, Darwin was a genius because he understood how evolution works without having access to microscopes and to knowledge about DNA and mutations. But Darwin was, as everyone in England at the time, very racist. And he did not avoid the problem of hierarchy between races. He also strongly believed that European white men were on top of the hierarchy. Darwin, in his book, The Origins of Species, only wrote a few lines about humans. The whole book is mostly about animals and the rest of nature. There's not a lot written about humans, and the little sections that are written about humans caused a lot of controversy because he says that humans come from earlier primates. So it means that we share a common ancestor with modern apes, and this was totally unacceptable at the time in England. And he also write a little bit about different populations of Earth. We can consider these races. For him, instead of being sanctioned by God, instead of being brought by divine creation, the hierarchy between human races is a result of evolution. Darwin considered at the time that the African race was the evolutive link between apes and modern white men. So this is totally terrible, but this is what Darwin was believing at the time in the intellectual context in which he was raised. On the picture here, you see the house in which he was born. Really wealthy people, wealthy family in Shropshire, England. Of course, they thought that European white men were on top of everything. And this is in this kind of intellectual context that anthropology came to be in Europe at the end of the 19th century. As you know, anthropology is a very young discipline, and it was a very racist discipline when it started. The first anthropologists really were interested in classifying everything around human beings instead of explaining really humanity. So they classified physical appearances of human beings, cultures, kinship systems, belief systems, and etc. So they had this very strong interest in classifying humans and, of course, in classifying races, among other things, defining human beings. They had this interest in defining clear racial categories, as everyone during the 19th century. But they were in a paradox, but they knew very well that there is no clear frontier between races. They fade into each other. It was now very visible in Europe during the 19th century because a lot of immigration happened at that time. And they were able to observe that racial mixing was totally normal and happening a lot around them. They were anxious to define stable, ideal, pure racial categories. On the images here, you see drawings made during the 19th century showing on the left Native American races or phenotypes, physical aspects, at the center Asians, and on the right African phenotypes. So this is this kind of classification early anthropologists were trying to make. As it was common occurrence in the 19th century, anthropologists were kind of afraid to see the different so-called pure races disappear because of a lot of racial mixing, a lot of movements between populations. So they struggled to identify what would be the ideal measurements, physical measurements for each human race. They were using Blumenbach's. And they thought that it was important or possible to define the essence of race with measurements. So they invented all sorts of tools to do that. And of course, when we talk about classification, very often we talk about hierarchy. It goes together. On top of it, early anthropology was really about what we call biological determinism, which means an important concept, which means that there is an association between physical traits or physical appearance and behaviors or intellectual abilities. So, in thinking in terms of biological determinism, cultural traits, behavioral traits, intellectual traits could be inherited not just individually, but at the scale of the whole population, just as biological traits would be inherited, and both go together. So there would be a behavioral difference, an intellectual difference, a cognitive difference that is innate between races. So following the same logic, if there is an innate cognitive difference, an intellectual difference between races, and this is inherited by blood, by people from different races, there is a hierarchy as well of intellectual abilities between human populations. So this was what people were thinking massively until the 20th century. And the first anthropologist who opposed this idea of biological determinism was Franz Boas. He was a professor at Columbia University in New York during the early 20th century. Boas wrote against biological determinism. He established that he supported the idea that we should separate biology and culture. We should separate biology and intellectual abilities, cognitive abilities in human beings. Culture is not inborn, culture is learned, and everything that comes with culture in behaviors, skills, etc., He was really the first one to do that. Boas is considered the father of modern anthropology. He studied in different places, mostly in Baffin Island in Canada, among Inuit populations, and on Ellis Island in New York City, where he was observing migrant European populations coming to the Americas and children of coming from parents from different cultural backgrounds. So he had a very great deal of cultural mixing in Baffin Islands, a very interesting laboratory to study the link between race and culture. So Boas was saying that culture is not inborn. We learn how to behave in a cultural context. We don't behave because of our racial background, how we look physically. The environment, the cultural environment here, plays a large role in determining the behavior of a person. The human environment around plays a big role in determining what your culture will be, what your interests and skills will be. So differences in culture are not due to biology. They're due to how we learn to do things around us. So there is no human race, what we call race, that is smarter or more skilled at doing one thing because people belong to a certain racial background. It is learned. It is how we behave, our intellectual abilities as a population, our cognitive characteristics are learned. They're not inborn. This is what Boas says. So it totally confronted, it totally it was against the idea of biological determinism. But Boas was a scholar, a university professor. He was known by scholars, but not known by the general population of Europe and America at the time. So even if Boas brought these innovative ideas that culture and behaviors are not inborn, people in general in the population did not share his ideas. Politicians did not share his ideas at all. And at the same time, when Boas was writing his innovative books and describing these ideas among scholars, there is a movement that was born in Europe, in the Americas, and this movement is called social Darwinism. And this is a kind of a dangerous idea. It is using Darwin's theory of natural selection, but applying it to societies. So, according to social Darwinism, there is a possibility of evolution in society as there is a possibility of evolution in nature. But while we can hardly control what happens in nature around us, we can totally control what happens in society. And this is the dangerous idea. It starts there. Social Darwinism would mean that a population, a culture, a human society could be improved by promoting the reproduction of these individuals with good genes, and those who are fit, but not physically fit, socially fit. And by discouraging or prohibiting the reproduction of individuals with bad genes, with, those considered unfit socially. This famous phrase, the survival of the fittest, does not come from Darwin for natural selection. It comes from those who brought social Darwinism as a concept, as an idea. And social Darwinism involving the socially fit and the socially unfit, of course, it involved the idea of biological determinism, and the idea of races. not blatantly, more subtly, but it involves races. Social Darwinism comes from the term, and the development of the theory comes from Francis Galton. He was Darwin's cousin. So I repeat the main idea here. We can improve human societies by encouraging the the breeding or the reproduction of those with good genes, the socially fit, what he called superior stocks. It looks like we talk about animals here, but it's human beings who were in England at the time those socially fit. They were wealthy. According to Galton, the ability of being wealthy was inherited just as physical traits. This is biological determinism. Who were wealthy? Who was wealthy in England at the time? White populations. And we should discourage or even prohibit, according to the theory, the reproduction of those socially unfit, what he called the inferior stocks, the poor, criminals, mentally disabled, homosexuals, etc. So who was poor in England? At the time, there were non-white populations. So social Darwinism, this very racist idea, involved the idea of human physical characteristics and what we call races. Social Darwinism, when we explain it today, sounds very unethical. One should not intervene in the reproduction of human beings, whatever their racial background is. It's totally racist. But we sometimes hear such ideas around us still today. According to social Darwinism, for example, charity is discouraged because if we help the poor too much, they will, oh my goodness, they will have too many babies, and they will perpetuate the circle of poverty. This is social Darwinism. It was discouraging charity. We should not help the poor. And I've heard on the radio, coming to teach this class last year at the college, someone, the open phone lines when you can call the radio station and say your opinion. I heard someone, and it was someone with a political position in Ottawa. I don't remember who, but this person called the radio station to say that shelters in Ottawa are too comfortable. And they encourage people not to get out of poverty by themselves. This person considered that we help the poor too much, we help homeless people too much. And if we help them too much, they might have children, which is not good. So we still hear that around in the 21st century, and this is social Darwinism. It's a dangerous idea. Social Darwinism led in the past to the ideology of eugenics, and this was pretty strong in the United States after the human rights movement, or even before the human rights movement, when the slavery was abolished. Eugenics is social Darwinism, but put to an extreme. It was the idea of preserving the good genes, the good stock, the so-called founding populations of the Americas, the British colonies. And according to eugenics, there's a danger to mix races because it will dilute the white race into other races. So this is a very racist idea, but that was very widespread in the United States in the 20th century. And I will talk next week about the concept of hypodescent, which comes with that. But social Darwinism, what you have to remember is that it comes from the idea of natural selection. It applies it to human societies. It is very unethical because it involves controlling the reproduction of human beings. and controlling it in different manners depending on the race of the person. And it is, well, it's unethical. For example, before slavery ended in the United States, Black babies, African American babies, were desired by families, by white families owning slaves, because they were wealth, they were possessions of white families, and they were free slaves you didn't have to buy because they were naturally coming to you. But after slavery was abolished, these same babies were not desirable anymore because they were additions to the African American population that was now free, with which white populations had to share their privileges. And a lot of African American women were sterilized against their knowledge sometimes, and surely against their will, because of eugenics and social Darwinism. They didn't, wealthy Americans did not want these women to have Black children. So women, for example, could go to the hospital to have a surgery, any surgery, and being sterilized while they were having the surgery. So this happened by World War II. 65,000 African American women were sterilized against their will, and this has led to the eugenics movement. So the very concept of social Darwinism, of eugenics, led in the past in many places in the world to terrible consequences. Laws regulating marriages or interracial marriages, forced sterilizations of women. And if you think about the concept and how it was used by some politicians, it led to genocides even. Nazi Germany was based on the idea of eugenics.